everyone. I'm John Denham, and I'm the director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics. We still have one or two people joining us, but one or two people who seem to be locked out, but we'll get underway as quickly as possible. At least I can do the introduction for those of you who are on the call. The topic today is taking back control, making English devolution work. And we've got a great panel who you're going to hear from very shortly. Alex Norris, Labour MP for Nottingham North. He had previously been a city councillor in Nottingham, and since 2021, he's been the Shadow Minister for Levelling Up, part of Lisa Nandy's team. Sir David Lidington was the Conservative MP for Aylesbury from 1992 to 2019, 6 years as Minister of State for Europe, and under Theresa May was Leader of the House and then Minister of the Cabinet Office, where, though not formally given this name, was widely regarded as the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. We have Jessica Studdert, who's the Deputy Chief Executive of NewLocal, an independent think tank and network of local authorities who aim to transform public services and unlock community power. And finally, Bren, Albiston, a lawyer who is the chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers Constitutional Committee. Just quickly on the call, you'll see hopefully that there's a chat function, which is to enable people on the call to talk amongst themselves. If you have a question that you would like to put to the panel, please put those in under the Q&A function. That's the one I'll be monitoring, and I will be trying to put questions, or at least the gist of people's questions, to the panel, and I'll take as many of those as I possibly can. So the background to this, of course, is a very live debate about English devolution. There's a levelling up legislation making its way through Parliament at the moment, implementing some of the policies in the government's levelling up white paper. Keir Starmer, in line, it has to be said, with every single leader of the opposition in my lifetime, has promised an unprecedented shift of power from Whitehall to local authorities, but has promised a taking back control bill as one of the key items in the first King's speech in the new Parliament. And yet progress on the ground is relatively slow, I would suggest. So what we want to do today is really try to get underneath the arguments that are shaping English devolution policy, and to work out what could be done to make it move more quickly, and particularly to make it effective. So I'm going to go first to Alex to set out perhaps something of Labour's aspirations and how Labour policy is taking shape, and perhaps, if you could, Alex, the differences as you see it between what you might be wanting to do and what's currently making its way through Parliament. So over to you.
Thanks, John. There's no better way than the moderator starting by saying how unoriginal your plans are. That always, if nothing else, that sets me a low bar to clear. But I'll take that in the spirits it's intended, and we'll see how we get on. I mean, the question, first of all, is, why English devolution? What is it in service of? And so far, primarily, I think it's been seen through an economic lens. It's why it's so intrinsically bound up in the levelling up agenda. The point of saying that if we want decent, skilled work in all nations, regions, sub-regions, across all communities in this country, then we believe that putting those levers and the resources in the hands of local people is the best way of shaping that. That it sounds axiomatic because there's political consensus on it. It's not, and it's important that we start from there. And from that, you can build on to questions of, what you could do on more direct social programs for good as well. But at the moment, it's primarily, I think, through an economic lens. And what is it? Well, what it is relatively simple. It's a shift of money and power from Whitehall to Town Hall, and in its nature, generally combined authorities of local authorities rather than directly to local authorities. And that is always an issue, I think, worth teasing out, which we will do in due course. The challenge with the status quo is that what we have is a relatively arbitrary and inconsistent setup. It would be very hard to explain to a not particularly interested in this area observer about why we have what we have now. And one of our particular things we need to, as well as deepen the settlement with an expansion of the powers and resources available, which I'll touch on in a second, we need to widen participation and get to the extent that it's possible to get everybody into arrangements that can allow them to receive such powers should they wish for that to be the case. On the powers point of view, we are in, I always want a better phrase than this. Jess, you're a better phrase maker than me, but I want a better phrase than an arms race. But we're in, I think, a very positive arms race with the government. That, you know, in January, as you said, Keir set out with his Take Back Control speech, a series of areas around skills, around housing, around transport, that we wanted to go further in the devolved settlement in. And, you know, what we've seen in the Trailblazer deals contains elements of that. Not all of it. We particularly think we should be going further on skills beyond the adult skills budget. We also think we should be going further on real localization of DWP and employment support more generally. We think you could get into culture spending as well. So there remains some areas of difference of that, and that would be very much the focus of, as you say, legislation very early on, were there to be a change of government. It's probably useful to say at this point as well, John, and to again hopefully spark some questions from the audience too, is that this is in service of, you know, better economy, of levelling up, of you know, having communities where across the country with better prospects. You know, as I say, primarily it's been economic, but I don't think we should set our ambitions only at that. I believe, and I'm not one who generally exaggerates, but I think this is one of the key tools in rescuing our democracy. You know, I suspect we're all here because we love our democracy and we're interested in it and its operation. So I suspect we share an anxiety when we open social media up about where it is and where it feels like it is. And this is, you know, this is the title of the seminar. It's what we heard in 2016. It's what we heard as far back as 2014 about a desire amongst the public to take back control. That yes, devolution, because we believe it will deliver better economic outcomes, but devolution because the process of devolution, of having greater power and control over your lives and your communities, has a high degree of expectation amongst the public that we absolutely must meet. And I'll come, the little point to come on to after that in a second, but I first just want to deal with money, because it is a devolution of power and money. We have to, and again, this is a point of difference between the two parties at the moment. We've got to get away from the Hunger Games, beauty parades, again, however you want to characterize it, style of funding that have led to very very eccentric outcomes in funding, that if again you were trying to explain to someone from another country or another planet, you wouldn't be able to do so. We have to get, you know, those processes are debilitating. You know, constantly jumping through those hoops takes so much steam out of local authorities, not to mention the disappointment within communities, because you always engage with your community to work up such bids. So we have to get to a more consolidated funding settlement targeted at deprivation and need, and that again is one of the sort of the pillars of our approach. But if what, and I'll finish on this point because I know we're on introductory remarks mode. I have a habit of getting going sometimes, but if what people get from devolution is a shift of power from the centre to sub-regional bodies, that will be a good thing for all the reasons that we will discuss today. That will not be taking back control, not even close. This has to be, you know, and lots of people on this call, having looked at who's here, I know who are working in this space, which is very exciting. It has to be a double devolution model that respects that, yes, the centre does things for, you know, local authorities and combined authorities that they could do for themselves, but those local authorities can do things for communities that they can do for themselves, and that has to be a shift of power. And we've staked out, you know, Lisa late last year staked out the community right to buy, for example, building out from the right to bid in the Localism Act. Similarly, you know, we will be coming forth in due course with mirroring commitments around the right to challenge, which hasn't worked, but that principle of getting the public into decision making on the services that affect their lives, that's hugely important. We have to deliver meaningful community power. Otherwise, this will be very, very interesting for people like us. This will drive better economic outcomes, and it will leave all the public challenge still underneath it, and we absolutely must meet that test. So I hopefully have provoked a number of issues there for other panelists and for the audience, John, but I'll probably put a cork in it at this point.
Alex, thank you very much indeed. That's a very good and admirably brief introduction. We'll come back, I think, and pick up quite a few of the points you've raised there during the discussion. And apologies, by the way, to anybody who's joined slightly late. We had some technical problems with some of the people who had registered, but I hope you're all with us now. David, can I come to you? And interested really in, you were in government through a lot of the period of time from the original Northern Powerhouse, and so through other discussions. I'd be interested in your sense of how Conservative policy has evolved and why perhaps it's in the shape that it is today.
Yeah, thanks, John. There's a lot in what Alex said that I would agree with. I think if you look at my party's history on this, you go back to a view at the time, thinking back to the Thatcher government in particular, that spending, borrowing at local authority level was getting out of hand. And I think I'm convinced with the active support of the civil service in Whitehall, that government then sought to solve the problems by centralising decision-making and imposing controls from the centre. We saw John Prescott, when Labour came to office in 1997, trying to put powers into regional development authorities, though again, there were two problems, I think, with that. One was that there was still a very strong degree of central control, and successive governments, Conservative and Labour, have wrestled with this tension between the idea on the one hand of autonomy for whether for local or sub-regional or regional bodies, and on the other hand, the wish to see them as implementing bodies, there to ensure that the central government's policies were carried out effectively at local or regional level. I think the problem with the RDAs also had been that they were seen as, in my view correctly, as being just too remote. They were too big to really connect with anybody's sense of place, and particularly if you represent a seat, as I did in the southeast of England, the southeast RDA just stretching from Thanet to Milton Keynes via the Isle of Wight really didn't add up to anything to which people felt they belonged. So the tendency then in the Conservative Party was to, right, we've got to get rid of all of this. What was very striking is that when George Osborne came in, by 2010, he'd had a term as the Member of Parliament for a constituency just south of Manchester, Tatton, and he changed his views. And the coalition government's approach and the subsequent Cameron government's approach was very much driven, I think, by George Osborne's energy and commitment personally. And if you look back in the years since 2010, I think the appetite of coalition and Conservative governments for devolution of the kind we're discussing has depended hugely upon how interested and keen the Central Secretary of State was in driving that agenda forward. For Osborne, this was about economic regeneration more than anything else. And he looked at Greater Manchester on his constituency doorstep. He felt, having talked to Labour parties, but the Conservative Party leaders in local government, there was the possibility of a deal there. And he was excited by the prospect of the new arrangements leading to regeneration of Greater Manchester. And he saw this as the trailblazer for something that could be used to regenerate northern conurbations, without which happening, it would be very difficult to get overall UK economic regeneration and competitiveness. So I think Osborne saw we couldn't simply rely on London and the southeast indefinitely to be the engines of growth. With George, as always, there was a political dimension. I think there's few of us who've been elected politicians who if we look into our inmost souls, would pretend that we're spotlessly clean and clear of any sort of political overtones. And for Osborne, clearly there was the thought, well, actually, if this works, then that might get the Conservative Party some more support, make us more credible in the north of England if we're seen to be delivering something that's putting power into their hands. And I think as we went on with this model of an executive mayor on a sort of metropolitan area basis, you saw some of the problems that arose. Even in Greater Manchester, it was not easy, I think, to get all the local authorities to sign up to the eventual deal. in South Yorkshire, I could remember business leaders telling me that even though every local authority in that area was Labour, they had taken a very long time and very tense negotiations before they finally agreed on a mayoral model to which they would all subscribe. And when we look at the some of the difficulties in the current settlement and some of the inconsistencies, we can see that powers differ from one place to another. Andy Burnham exercises the powers of a police and crime commissioner. Andy Street in the West Midlands does not do that. The governments in the last 16 years have insisted on a mayoral model, and I think that that does has acted as a disincentive in some parts of the country who would like to embrace this devolutionary agenda, but who do not want the mayoral model that goes with it at the moment. I don't think that until very recently, huge thought has been given to non-metropolitan areas and how you deal with those. And of course, there has been really no precept arrangements, but there's no real devolution of revenue raising or borrowing powers to any significant extent. And that's a difference between how other democracies with a longer history of devolution operate. And there's always been and continues to be a tension within the Conservative Party over the need for financial control on the one hand and a wish to devolve power on the other, and also between the tendency to look to work within an area that has a coherent economic geography, and on the other hand, an attachment to historic boundaries and to people's sense of place and identity. And the economic geographies and the sense of historic identity and of place and of belonging do not always coincide neatly, and that does make for some problems. And we've seen the attention differ depending on who has been in senior office. I think it's fair to say that this was not something that was top of the agenda in Theresa May's time as Prime Minister. I think the new energy behind it in more recent years is less to do with Boris Johnson than actually due to the fact that Michael Gove genuinely believes in this agenda and has taken the lead in trying to make it happen in Whitehall, as we're seeing with the Levelling Up bill at the moment. At least there you have some statutory framework for devolution. You have an obligation on government to sort of produce annual statements of progress on its missions on levelling up. There's a provision for combined county authorities to be created with devolved powers, although still the lean towards the mayoral model. But I think there's still some important questions that whoever is elected in a general election next year are going to have to address. I mean, one is to what extent a devolutionary model at, let us call it sub-regional level, should be compulsory, because we think that makes for good governance, or should it be bottom up as it has been up till now? I'm inclined still to go with bottom up, although personally I would get rid of two-tier local authorities and I would have unitary boroughs and counties, and I think that in turn would make the sub-regional devolution easier to move towards. And then should it be based, should a sub-regional devolution be based on city regions, in effect, as it has up till now? And if not, what are the boundaries? Because if you're going for county level authorities, you're going to be dealing with devolved authorities that have smaller populations than they do now, but have a degree of certainly historic coherence and a genuine sense of people's part that they belong to these. So I only have to raise the suggestion that you merge Devon and Cornwall before you give them devolutionary powers. So you will immediately see where the ructions will start to rise if we simply try to insist that there's an arbitrary population level which a devolved sub-regional body has to meet. Then finance. To what extent should we devolve tax revenues? To what extent should we devolve borrowing powers? And I'm broadly looking very seriously at what countries like Germany do. In Germany, you have a certain amount of tax revenues allocated to the lender for them to determine how it should be spent. But I think Rachel Reeves, every bit as much as Jeremy Hunt, is going to be very vigilant about not losing too much control when it's national government that will get blamed if overall national borrowing or overall national spending and tax take starts to run out of control. And I don't think anybody has yet come up with the answer to this conundrum. But I also believe that, while I support what Alex said about the democratic importance of devolution, a final point is this: I think in the current constitutional environment, devolution in England is the great missing element from the 1998 constitutional settlement. It's the bit that was left unfinished, along with the House of Lords. At the moment, we have a United Kingdom where you have devolved Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, where this is not, it's not clear what is English and what is United Kingdom when it comes to policy making or accountability. And that, I think, makes for greater friction between the centre and the devolved governments and parliaments. And it also means that England is now the largest people, the English, the largest people in Europe that don't have any sort of parliament or assembly of their own. So I think that we need both changes to the structure of Whitehall to enable the English interest to be better and more transparently represented when it comes to government decisions. And I think that we need to have a devolutionary settlement in England. I would add Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too, which in my judgment are all far too centralised at the moment. But I think it becomes easier for Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland to find themselves a comfortable place in a United Kingdom where they are part of a pattern of devolution, which is happening in all four of the United Kingdom nations.
Thank you very much indeed. A whole series of questions there for our discussion later on. If people are interested in the governance of England as a whole, if you look on our website, you can see our recent seminar with Diane Coyle and others looking at how England should be governed at the centre. But can we go now from the centre to the very local? And I think Alex already touched on the tension between the level of structures that are needed for economic development and the communities in which people actually live. So I'd like to bring Jess in now to talk about the community empowerment aspect of this devolution debate.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. Really agree with so much of the analysis from Alex and David so far. I think it's just important to kind of reflect at this stage. We're actually 10 years into devolution as a formal policy. The first deal with Greater Manchester was done in 2014. So it feels like that in that 10 years, there's obviously been progress, but it's been in a particular model and it's been quite stop-start. And it sort of feels like the recent progression of the devolution framework, which finally set out what had been kind of rather untransparent and unclear, sort of asymmetric, as David was saying, devolution of powers, that some people have some things and some others don't. And the trailblazer devolution deals have really broken through new ground. So it is possible now to say that funds are devolved, not just delegated, with a strong degree of oversight, and the single pot has been a big breakthrough. So what we have seen so far overall is quite a tightly managed form of devolution, which has been done on the terms of the centre. And some departments have been able to be completely disengaged, some have been active, but it hasn't been a kind of whole government approach to date. So obviously, whoever wins the next general election, whichever party might do so, they will be at the beginning of 5 years in power, where it is possible to set a more kind of a long-term clear direction of travel. And it's really good, Alex obviously referred to arms race, it's really good that there is a degree of cross-party consensus. It's the right model. Mayors aren't going to go away. They can't be disbanded like RDAs were disbanded. They're obviously using their platform and advocating for more powers. So there is a case that there's an inherited framework, and so there's a sense of what's done a bit faster, what's expanded a bit more, and it's great to hear Alex's ideas for what Labour would potentially do. I just wanted to sort of set out a few areas where I think it could be a bit more ambitious, and I guess to date it feels like the starting point of devolution. Obviously, it's had an economic driver primarily, but the starting point really has been what's government prepared to let go of, rather than what would enable all parts of our country to genuinely thrive. And if you had that kind of broader starting point, it would open up questions about well-being, about resilience, about economic inclusion, and some of the factors that local governments in places grapple with. And the current model is quite a specific focus on specific central government functions from particular departments reallocated, but largely the same, but just reallocated to combined authorities. So just to kind of set three particular areas on the table for discussion. Firstly, around the, as John was mentioning, the kind of community powered aspects of devolution. Obviously, and the title of this session sort of reflects it, the idea that the backdrop that we're all working to is this rising sense of alienation from decision making, in the sense that people don't feel the system is working for them. So devolution should be an opportunity to really drive subsidiarity, which is a clunky word, but effectively people feeling that decisions are made closer to them, close to the lowest possible level to them, and where possible with their active participation. But the devolution model to date, where new democratic elements have largely just begun and ended with the introduction of mayors, and mayors have had positive benefits. They've certainly become strong figureheads for the sub-regions they represent, and they're certainly using their soft convening power really well across the sub-regions, and they're working together, and they're really pushing the envelope in terms of what more powers they could get from central government. So they're setting the pace of the debate on devolution to a large extent. But it's important to note that where people have been offered a vote on whether they want a new mayor, they have tended to reject them. It's arguable that in itself gives people a sense of more democratic kind of ownership and participation. So a few kind of suggestions. There's a whole range of real innovation being driven from local government largely, but increasingly some mayoral combined authorities looking at using more deliberative democracy, more direct participative elements, drawing people into both direct community-led decision-making processes and how budgets might be spent locally in neighbourhoods, but also drawing people into some of those more strategic decision-makings over how to tackle climate change. I don't see any reason why people in a sub-region can't have more say over transport investment. People know intimately how their transport networks are working or are not. They have a valid say. So I wonder whether in the future more kind of requirements could be built in to have ongoing deliberation into the deal making process. So existing deals or expanded ones build in and hardwire a sense of ongoing deliberative democracy. I think that I sort of hesitate to require areas to do things. It's not part of my sort of localist philosophy, but it's certainly kind of in keeping with a lot of what is happening locally anyway, and increasing amounts of areas, people are really understanding that getting people together to kind of discuss trade-offs, move towards consensus building is a really important way of making effective decisions and crucially having people feel they've got input into those decisions. Labour's Take Back Control bill is certainly an opportunity to consider not just from the kind of top down what powers can go into areas, but from the bottom up and in parallel what rights you can give communities, and what level of kind of expectation of participation they can be given. And Alex mentioned Labour have already committed to a community right to buy, which would support community ownership of important local assets. I think there's scope for thinking about what rights communities might have to shape public services and to participate in the design and delivery of services that matter to them, or they use directly. And I think there's certainly lots of learning to be done from the shortcomings of the Localism Act, which did have some new community rights, but they were quite weak, sometimes set up in opposition to local authorities and of course accompanied by austerity. So there was limited capacity to kind of respond to those rights. So I think if devolution is seen as both kind of reallocating power from Whitehall departments and reallocating power up to communities to create that expectation of participation, you could begin to create a different expectation of what it means to be in a democratic area, in a combined authority area, and how you might participate outside of traditional elections. I think Labour have also looked at local public accounts committees, which are always a great idea. We can see how the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee plays quite a valuable role in understanding and driving accountability for public spend. I think there is an opportunity to create these at the combined authority level, which would really kind of drive that line of sight over public spend and activity in an area. I think that at their most effective, they would hold kind of open, transparent inquiries. Potentially, communities would be able to kind of trigger have petitions to trigger inquiries into issues. I think if they had a line of sight across not just combined authority or local authority spend, but all public sector spend in an area, they would be quite powerful vehicles for understanding how public money is spent in an area, and certainly open transparency to communities within those areas. Secondly, just a couple of other areas. To date, and it's been mentioned already, there's obviously been quite a specific economic growth focus through devolution. This doesn't necessarily have to be how it was. In fact, the Greater Manchester councils, whose collaborative working over the decades and years really did inform the model of devolution we see now. In Greater Manchester, there was always a sense that one side of the coin is economic growth and the other side is public service reform. Growth, better growth and more powerful growth levers is designed to create the opportunities, but public service reform is designed to support people to take advantage of those opportunities and remove barriers to work, particularly health barriers. And I think if you talk to GM and the authorities in Greater Manchester, really over the years, they've taken a lot of learning from being part of schemes like Total Place, but they were also one of the whole place community budget pilots in around 2011. They then got health devolution, way ahead of where we're now with integrated care systems, which are everywhere. So there's a sort of sense that although Greater Manchester can be seen as a sort of poster child for effective devolution, actually a lot of their collaborative working has been around public service reform, which they continue to this day, as well as the economic growth side. So I think that there's ways in which elements of public services could be put on the table with devolution, and certainly some of the big health, big spending departments like health, DFE, and a large extent DWP have been slightly absent the devolution agenda. And we're seeing more of a place focus coming from the Department of Health. It's just that it's quite misaligned from devolution. So integrated care systems have grown up on hospital footprints rather than democratic boundaries. And there's going to be a time at which there's going to need to be some realignment of that. At the moment, we've got different parts of Whitehall with a different understanding and definition of place that aren't necessarily talking to each other. So if you did that from the perspective of what would help people thrive, you could have questions like why not devolve early years? Why not think about how over the life course areas can have more control over how the system supports them. And finally, I'm glad somebody's already mentioned fiscal devolution, because I was going to bring it up. I think fiscal devolution is inevitable. It's the inevitable next step. It's where the trailblazer areas must go. Despite 10 years of devolution, we still are an outlier internationally in terms of the degree of fiscal centralisation. Still only 5% of all taxation in the UK is local, and that compares with about 30% in Germany, more like 50% in Canada. And I think there's also increasing recognition that we are, on the one hand, we're highly fiscally centralised, and on the other hand, we are significantly regionally unequal, and that these two things might be linked. And this is certainly backed up by OECD data. Politicians do tend to be cautious about fiscal devolution.
Yes, I'm going to draw you slightly. Could you?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me just do my final pitch for fiscal devolution. I think there's a strong case for setting out an element of what currently goes nationally in income tax and VAT to be retained locally in different areas, which would drive different incentives for growth. And there's a principle behind business rates localisation, which is already occurring, which is that local areas need more control over their own taxation. So I will leave it there and hope we can carry on the discussion.
I hope we pick up on that as we go along. All of this has to be translated into legislation in some ways, and the next speaker, final speaker, is Bren Albiston, who's been giving some thought to whether we should be looking at quite a different legal structure for the powers and the accountability of local government. Bren.
Thanks, John. Yes, so I'm going to talk about turning policy into law and some of the difficulties with that generally, and specifically about this kind of policy agenda. But I think first we need to be clear that legislation of this kind, seeking to achieve the kind of structural change envisaged by both parties, is fundamentally constitutional in nature, and this constitutional dimension needs to be considered very carefully. In my view, governance reform in England can no longer be seen as a simple exercise of reforming local government, but as a transition to devolved government. And without this fundamental shift in mindset, any programme of reform is likely to reproduce and indeed make worse the problems which already exist in the current system. With that said, before I go into talk more specifically about the legislative challenges faced with this kind of initiative, the difficulties with turning either party's devolution aspirations into law are largely the same as for any other project. And as a legal practitioner, I see these problems time and time again. I would recommend anybody to read Justice David Goddard's excellent book, Making Laws That Work. And he's identified a number of common issues, which, as I say, I come across most days of my working life. So the first problem is what he refers to as the damp squib. That is legislation that is enacted, but the world doesn't change, or at least not very much. A common problem that leads to this is that people whose behaviour the legislation is intended to influence are not aware of it or don't understand it. This can be ameliorated through ensuring that the law and information about it is accessible. But if key actors are not aware of the law or its implications for them, what it enables them to do or requires them to do, then their behaviour will not change and the law will not work. Another common factor is that the people who are supposed to benefit from the change do not have the knowledge, skills, or most importantly, resources, particularly financial resources, to be able to use the law effectively. Further, it may be that institutions tasked with carrying through the actions legislated for don't do it or don't do it very well, or where enforcement miscues, that is, where the institutions tasked with enforcing the legislation don't understand it and don't use it as intended. It may equally be a problem that the law is too big and becomes unwieldy. The next issue, sort of headline, is overshoot. That is where the laws achieve what it was intended to achieve, but fails to stop there. That can increase the cost of administering the law and causes other systemic issues. Then there's nasty surprises. Similar to overshoot, it may be that the law produces other unexpected, undesirable results. The typical result this typically results from a failure to think through the long-term consequences of a law and how people will respond to it. It may be that nasty surprises can result from a lack of institutional capacity or will to administer the law as intended. And then finally, the backfire, i.e., where the law creates perverse results. What an economist might call the Cobra effect, which is named after a famous case in colonial India, where the colonial authorities paid people to hunt and kill cobras, but instead led to people breeding cobras to kill them, to hand in the skins and get paid for them. The thread that runs through all these issues is behaviour. People not behaving as desired, not changing their behaviour, or changing their behaviour in a way that's backfires. In order to avoid these issues, Justice Goddard identified a number of specific questions when thinking about drafting legislation, but can be distilled into broadly 4 questions. So the first, what is the situation now? Well, England is, in every meaningful sense, as David and other speakers have touched on, the constitutional odd one out. Whilst there are several areas of England which do have some degree of devolution, there is no uniform devolution of powers across the country, and there is a patchwork of different arrangements with wildly different powers and responsibilities. This leads to confusion for the public and other constitutional actors, which in turn leads to a lack of accountability. Further, what powers have been devolved or consolidated are very limited, particularly when compared to the range of powers available to other devolved governments. Indeed, these arrangements have largely simply inherited powers that have always been exercised outside of central government, alongside certain further powers granted pursuant to the Localism Act and the new Trailblazer arrangements. Consequently, England is left to be governed directly by the UK government and UK ministers. Indeed, even where there has been a degree of devolution or reorganisation, such arrangements are still best described as local rather than devolved government. Therefore, when we are thinking about the further development of devolution in England, we have to consider how any new legislative framework will deal with this patchwork and its shortcomings, but also if there is anything about it worth saving, such as the relative flexibility of the current arrangements, together with considering what we definitely want to get rid of, such as, for example, the current method of awarding grants to different local and devolved governments, as well as thinking about what is there already but needs improving upon. The next heading is, how will legislation change what happens in the short and long term? This is, of course, dependent on what we want the legislation to achieve. The Take Back Control Act has been billed as the greatest transfer of powers from the centre since devolution in the 1990s. A number of specific powers or areas of policy have been identified as part of that process. However, each and every one of these areas, once devolved, could have a number of effects intended and unintended. I can't speak to those specific policies, however, what I can speak to are possibly the constitutional effects of this type of change more broadly. For example, the programme of devolution of powers will fundamentally alter the relationship between the centre and the periphery. Therefore, consideration must be given to the mechanisms and institutions required to manage that change and its effects into the future. Further, as more and more competences are devolved, some central government departments will find that they have progressively different degrees of responsibility across England, such that policy formation and execution becomes more difficult. Therefore, thought must be given to how this is managed. The central point being, we must not only consider how each of the freshly devolved policy areas will affect service delivery, but how all these changes will work together as a package and affect what effect will have on the government and functions of the state more broadly, particularly the relationships between constitutional actors. And 3, how sure are we that legislation will in fact create the change? Well, one positive aspect of our current devolution arrangements in England is that we have almost by accident run a number of experiments as to whether devolution is sought by local communities and their representatives, as well as the willingness of those representatives to use those powers once devolved. Others will be better able to tell you if that necessarily leads to better policy outcomes, but the consensus is that better policy outcomes will likely result. However, an important part of ensuring this is the case is that there are sufficient means to monitor the use of these powers and hold these newly empowered decision makers to account. And of course, it may be that there is a requirement for some kind of mechanism to compel the relevant actors to take action. And then finally, if we're not very sure what this means or that what effects it will have, what does that mean for the design of the legislation? Or should we legislate at all? As I said, ultimately, we cannot be sure what the effectiveness of these changes will be. Therefore, there needs to be sufficient flexibility built into the legislative framework to manage that uncertainty and ensure that lessons can be learned and changes made. That being said, this flexibility needs to be tempered against the need for certainty and not only for constitutional actors, but the public as well. And I can talk more about this more specific sort of legal changes we might want to kick off and talk about later. But I think that's a good sort of overview of the key constitutional legislative challenges we have to grapple with.
Bren, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. So a range of challenges. I've got a few questions in the Q&A, but could I just say to participants, put some questions into the Q&A function, and I'll try and raise those. But Alex, could I come back to you first off with, if you like, implicit challenges from what you've heard so far? It has been a long, drawn-out process to get where we are today. You could go back to John Gummer's Government Office of the Regions in 1994, I suppose, via RDAs, and here we are. Two questions to you, really, Alex. What specifically do you think a new government can do to speed up the process? And secondly, and you touched on this earlier, but perhaps you could expand a bit, what's the balance going to be between continuing the deal-based process, area by area, and actually giving local areas powers as of right? And will those be to localities as we have them, or will there be a requirement to come up, you know, following David's point, a particular regional structure or economic functional geography? So how do we actually speed up if this is so important to our vision of how England is governed, and how much of the powers as of right?
So, I mean, those are very important questions. I mean, you posed me those questions from Southampton, which I think is probably quite an interesting test case of Hampshire, the Solent, and the thing for us is that we want to get away from a deal-based model that means that those geographies are top-down. You know, your two major hurdles are geography and governance model. I have to be a little bit careful about, as you can see when I was pulling my punches a little bit earlier, around where we are in the policy process. But just if you're going to get everybody in, you have to do something different on your approach to geography and governance. So that's about as far as I'm willing to go on that question, but I hope you kind of see the implication within that. And then the second point on the harmony, and this is really important. Any new government would inherit a settlement that has evolved asymmetrically over however long you want to date it, whether you want to say 10 years or longer. What you can't do, you know, this isn't a what are the things that me and Lisa really think the country should be structured as, and completely reboot the thing. That's not going to work. That's not going to happen. You have to build on what you've got and build out from what you've got. I think one of the ways that you can have a greater deal of harmonisation, because we're seeing anyway in the deals that are now coming through, the sort of post-white paper deals, for all the negotiations, they look very, very similar. And we are seeing a greater alignment of them. The way in which I think you could speed up alignment, and I'm pretty sure Lisa's announced this before, so I don't think I'm going to get smited down, but to give, and I pushed this amendment in the Levelling Up Bill as well, a right to request. So for one devolved authority, combined authority, to say, well, actually, we don't have power over X, unlike another part of the country. If they can have it, we should be able to have it, and that would be the expectation would be that power would be granted. And I think you'd start to see a herding then. You wouldn't get rid of all your variants, but short of blowing the whole thing up, it's going to be difficult to do that anyway. That wouldn't be desirable. So I think that's one model to try and get yourself in then to a greater degree of kind of uniformity and things that are for the public slightly more accessible and understandable.
Thanks very much, Alex. If I could go a little bit further, I understand your hesitation about the policy process at this stage ahead of an election, but to what extent, if you took your right to request powers that have already gone to somebody else, to what extent do you think the central government is going to need to set conditions as to who can exercise that right to request? I suppose if I picked up something from David's opening, would you say to Devon and Cornwall, I'm sorry, but you're just going to have to overcome long periods of rivalry and resentment in order to get these powers? Or would it be more a matter of Cornwall should be able to get what Cornwall wants?
Well, I start from the principle that we ought to have access to these powers by dint of our common personhood. I've said this to you before, John, Jess, you've heard me say this, but I take it quite personally that when, originally when decisions were being made by ministers, there was a judgment made about the quality of the leadership and the readiness in Manchester, and a judgment made about the quality of the leadership and the readiness in Nottingham. I've lived half my life in Manchester, half my life in Nottingham, and Nottingham, it was go fish, and obviously Manchester have steamed forward and really made good of that. I still take that quite personally, and maybe there was an argument for that in the early days when you were when you were proving the concept. Okay, I don't think the case is that strong now. If we're saying that those powers are good when exercised locally, and that local decision makers want to and get their community involved, then actually I think we should be the balance of power should be on those opportunities going out to all really, rather than a notional sense of Whitehall being able to pick who's good and who's not. And I say this slightly churlishly, but not wholly. We still only have to do better than Whitehall. That's the bar here. This is not will new revolved arrangements make immediate utopia? Well, no, they'll be tricky. The things will be challenging, but I don't think the status quo is delivering so much for us that we should fear the chance for a bit of the new and the novel.
Thanks very much indeed. Tempting though it is to continue to quiz you alone on all the answers to these questions, I want to widen the discussion a bit. And firstly, could I come to you with a question raised by Richard Keeley, which is, because you've advocated clearly for the broadest devolution, if you like, in this discussion, and he raises the question about postcode lotteries and the likelihood in reality that some Whitehall ministers of every party will say, well, we can't let these things go because we'll get different services in different places or different outcomes. What's your argument to the postcode lottery case that's put for resisting change?
Sure. So my argument is that we already have a massive postcode lottery under a highly centralised system, and the biggest postcode lottery is that of life chances. We have highly unequal life expectancies that really vary according to place. So there's an extent to which a centralised system and kind of universal services where they exist are not actually meeting those facing marginalisation and facing extreme health inequalities. So I think there's a strong case, and actually this is quite important for kind of people on the left and the progressive kind of movement, where there might have been a sense that a kind of big society level intervention is the best for tackling inequalities. Actually, we're such an unequal society that an approach that really goes where people start from and builds out, but puts them at the centre and listens to the experience of people who are facing poverty and gives them a voice and a role in the service response and the state response that would help them get on in life. So I think that there's a need to sort of understand that postcode lottery sees uniformity of service outputs, but is a bit blind to service outcomes, and it's those outcomes I think devolution has a real opportunity to meet more effectively.
Thank you. Could I go, David, to you with a question from David Sweeting? Really, he sort of reflected back something you said. We come across with regional and sub-regional governance, and then they get introduced, then they get abolished. Firstly, is this going to be the fate of combined authorities? And I suppose, secondly, to you having been in government, what do you think governments could do to ensure that you don't get these huge swings of policy approach every time there's a change of government or indeed a change of minister?
I think that the answer to the first question is from Mr. Sweeting is clearly ultimately a set of arrangements that are brought into being by statute can be abolished by statute. I think the way to entrench these is to buttress them with a system of institutional working and law that gives them duties to perform, and also to do so in a way so that the main political parties at national level all feel that they want to have an influence over those sub-regional bodies. They want their man or woman elected as mayor or leader of this group, rather than saying, let's get rid of them. So, I mean, one of the other questions I saw in the chat talked about, so we've been talking about sort of allocating budgets as evidence of devolution. What about having duties? And I do think this is key. So I can remember a conversation I had with Andy Burnham when I was at the Cabinet Office, and exploring his appetite for taking on some of the criminal justice functions. And you could, I think, make a good argument for saying that community sentences, treatment orders, probation, possibly even the low security prisons, perhaps open prisons, could be devolved, or at least perhaps we could experiment with that to start with, to see how it worked. And as part, and so you devolve the duty to have an effective crime prevention strategy to that sub-regional level. So you could go about it in different ways, and I think rather than imposing a single set of rules, I would allow experiment, innovation, see what works. There have been cases, and probation is the most egregious recent example, where government tried, for all well-intended reasons, the Big Bang approach to reform, and it proved absolutely disastrous in practice. Whereas there were pilot projects that, if built upon, might have had a better outcome. I think institutionally, I think that you need to set up a structure in the Cabinet Office, which I think ought to be the department dealing with constitutional affairs. Went with Michael Gove because of Michael's particular interest in that. But I think it should sit in the Cabinet Office, and the Cabinet Office should then have a relationship on behalf of the UK government with the devolved English authorities, as it does with the devolved governments and parliaments of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland as well. So you build it into that structure. You bring together probably a national forum of mayors or leaders of these sub-regional authorities who would meet with secretaries of state or ministers of state concerned, perhaps as a sort of special cabinet committee of some kind each year. You would need to look at accountability. Does the mayor have to produce an annual report which the Public Accounts Committee looks at, as well as being accountable to local, to their own assembly or council? I don't have sort of set views on these things, but I think we need to explore and create an institutional structure that ensures that these arrangements, while capable of change and evolution, are seen as a natural and permanent part of the constitutional order.
Thank you, David. Bren, can I come to you then to follow up for that? And David's referred to a question, I think, at least by Mark Sanford, which is the extent to which, in your view, there should be a shift to having a discussion between local and centre about things that central government's already doing, where the locality says, well, we could do that better, to actually, can you get more entrenchment out of placing legal duties? What is the potential, as David is suggesting, for having some sort of joint forum or joint decision making between localities and the centre? And as a quick one, the short answer, please, are there other ways of entrenching what a new government does, which makes it harder to get rid of than, for example, RDAs to be abolished?
Yeah. So I think the question, I'll take the entrenchment points together, I think. So, I mean, in my view, and it's not a view shared by everybody, is that there are relatively straightforward ways for entrenching bits of legislation. I mean, there's a tension and a debate between, what entrenchment should look like. Should it be a formal mechanism, or should we try and engender some kind of political entrenchment, where the political cost of making changes is so significant that nobody would want to do it, or but I think we've seen that that kind of political entrenchment relies on a fundamental understanding and agreement about the rules of the game, which has broken down over the last little while. And so in my view, that kind of entrenchment doesn't work, or at least it's becoming a lot less effective. Then the legal mechanism terms, there is nothing, in my view, in our constitutional order which will prevent us from having what's called manner and form entrenchment, which is effectively where a piece of legislation says this part of this legislation will not be amended, say for through this special mechanism, and then you can then entrench that legislation itself. It's called double entrenchment, and there's nothing there's nothing that can stop you from doing that. The institutions for managing that relationship between the centre and the periphery are obviously going to be key. There is, of course, a difficulty with who will be on those kind of committees, and particularly on an all England basis, where we have a significant difference in the level of devolution across the country. So, will it be mayors only? Will it be combined authority executives only, or will it be the highest person in that particular geographical area will have an invitation to these things? And then what will it seek to achieve? Because clearly, where you've got different areas of devolution, they won't all have the same interests in being there. So if you've devolved certain aspects of healthcare where that level of devolution hasn't occurred elsewhere, then there's no point in having people from that region there the same way, because there won't be the necessity for them to have a joined up policy approach where that's seen as a positive. So I think there's a lot of issues there that need to be specifically dealt with, and to a degree, I mean, the law can set out a framework within which that can work, but as we've seen, I think with other intergovernmental institutions and relationships, it's really about people turning up and wanting to make them work, and the law can't make them do that. It can make it difficult for them not to do it, and make the punishments for not doing it more or less severe, but there's only so much a piece of legislation can do, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about behavior. It's about changing behaviors, and if the law doesn't do that effectively, either because it can't or it's not drafted correctly, then that's where we have to put our focus.
Thank you very much. So to some extent, entrenchment has to be political and behavioural. It can't simply be a legal concept, is perhaps what I hear being said there. And you picked up, I think, a point made, and I don't think there's necessarily an answer to it, by an anonymous attendee who's just pointing out the difficulty of representation of localities where some areas have no deal, some areas have trailblazers, some areas have something in between. Jessica, could I come back to you with a question from Sean Roberts? The newest kid on the block, but actually not part of Michael Gove's devolution agenda, are integrated care boards within the NHS, and the suggestion by Sean is that they're not really effectively accountable democratically. What would you say were the options of making them, well, if you agree with that, of making integrated care boards more democratic or subject to more democratic oversight in the future?
It's a really good question, and I think that's one of the challenges is the geography of integrated care systems and the boards that sit at the top of them is decoupled from the economic geography of devolution, apart from in some places like Greater Manchester where they're coterminous. And I think that there's a need to kind of what they present an opportunity to do is to look at whole population at that level, health needs, and then they have a strong principle of subsidiarity through to the place level and to the neighbourhood level, and there's a promise, not yet anywhere fulfilled, to then use those as a vehicle for more integration. And certainly, I mean, we do work with a few different health systems in different ways, and I think it is it's true to say that the health kind of infrastructure is talking to local government for the first time in a much more substantive way, and is finding out about what it means to work in a democratically accountable framework. But I think that eventually these different conceptions of place coming from Whitehall are going to have to align. And local authorities, it's very patchy how much they're able to participate in and bring their oversight of health outcomes to bear on health strategies. clearly there's everyone knows what Marmot has added to the debate. There's a real understanding that social determinants of health outcomes that rest in place, not all clinically led, really need to be brought to bear to be effective. And I think that there is a real opportunity there to, and I don't see that Labour's going to unpick those new health structures, but I think it is going to be a challenge that we've got these two different conceptions of place that are going to have to be reconciled at some stage. And then you can really begin to look at what public sector funding goes into a place and how horizontally it can be a bit better aligned for impact, and then crucially how communities can be a bit more involved and engaged in the system and how it works for them.
Thanks very much. Alex, can I come back to you with a couple of themes from that discussion? The first is what thought you have given to trying to make the Alex Norris bill an irreversible piece of legislation, which means that it is not immediately unpicked further down the line. But seriously, have you thought about this problem of entrenchment? And secondly, I think I'm right, in your opening remarks, you acknowledge that the discussion at the moment had largely been about economic growth and levelling up. But there are these big issues that Jess has raised about other public services that have been raised in the questions about ICBs. Is that parked for now in your thinking, or is that something you see as coming onto the agenda, say, within the first term of a Labour government?
Yeah, I mean, the ICB's point is such an interesting one in the sense that, you know, you look at all the blood, sweat and tears that, you know, let's say take me for my community in Nottingham, the blood, sweat and tears that we have to exercise in order to get the adult skills budget devolved to us. And then on the other hand, you're talking multiple billions of pounds worth of spend in our integrated care board, and that's done. And there's very, very little chatter about oversight and impact and all those things. There's a real kind of there's an incongruity of those two conversations. Now, and again, this might be a judgment about what my colleagues and successive leaders have thought. Well, this current leader has thought of me, but I did the health and care bill before I did the levelling up bill, one then the other. Either side of a reshuffle, and you know we'd have to let integrated care board bed in, you know, for whether for better or for worse. And I think the point about scrutiny was one well made. You know, we have to let them bed in. What we're not going to be able to do is find some sort of magic alignment of boundaries. There was a question. One of the first questions was, you know, why don't we replicate what they do in other places where they've made this work well? Well, a lot of those places have a high degree of alignment on, you know, traditional provinces or whatever. That is not us. And David made the point about policing. That adds another degree of trickiness. But that is the world as it is. You know, I think we have to work, work on what we've got in front of us before trying to add those extra bits in. So that's probably a lot around the house's way of saying I believe that is a parked conversation at this stage, John. Then on entrenchment, I mean, I take the view that, you know, because we know no group of people can bind others in the future, either parliaments or communities. You know, if these things can be done, there has to be a degree to which they can be undone. My firm belief is the more democracy you transfer, the harder it is for a minister to come up, certainly at a stroke of a pen, to take that away. You know, there's no precedent that I can think of for that. I mean, we got really upset when basically at the stroke of a pen, the minister changed the voting system for police and crime commissioners, which is, I think, quite an important and serious thing to have done. But I'm willing to accept that in the grand scheme of things might not be the top issue facing the nation today. But that is about as far as can be done. And the kind of pregnant in that is the point that Jess made. If local communities seek to discontinue or to change their model, that should probably come with a degree of sadness, but we should respect that. You know, if this is about taking back control, if this is about local decision making, then it should be that. You know, and I would hope that's not the case, but that can be the case, and I don't think that is the end of the world if that is the case. That's for communities to decide.
Thanks very much. Can I also put to you, while you're on the spot, another question from an anonymous attendee? There's a very specific point about replacement of EU funding and how monies are distributed across the regions. But I suppose my more general point is it's fairly clear that you won't be able to level up unless there's a level of resource in each part of England that enables people to meet their needs over time. Rachel Rees is not going to be pleased if you make any promises on this webinar. But could we at least, I suppose that everyone's looking for an acknowledgement that that is understood as a question that in government has to be faced at some point. And I'm just wondering whether you see that through an extension of what we've seen in the past, which is specific pots of money that have been targeted at particular problems, or whether you do see this as more fundamentally something that gets part of the local government formula, or is it perhaps the thing in between, which is the model in the trailblazer areas where you have some sums of government money that are devolved as a single pot with flexibility. I mean, all of those things could be fiscally neutral, but they're different ways of approaching it, and they have different degrees of, if you like, rights to be exercised powers at local level. And I just wondered where you are in thinking about, or how you assess the options that you see there at the moment. I think you said at the opening you didn't like the Hunger Games bidding for pots, so we assume there won't be more of those. But it'd be interesting to know what your thoughts are on fiscal issues.
Yeah, I mean, because I'm a little less enthused by fiscal devolution. I think there are freedoms you could give communities, you know, and there is a growing sense, certainly amongst the big cities, that they want to have the ability to levy some sort of overnight tax on tourism in order to help promote their nighttime offer. That seems to be the sort of freedom you should be able to have. If you can win that argument with your community, you should be able to do that. We went through a similar process. We got a workplace parking levy in Nottingham. You pay for anything more than, after your first 10 spaces, you pay a certain fee, and that goes into funding our public transport. Again, that was a very painful, decade-long process we went with our community, but we should have the freedom to do that. And in general, I would lean towards that. I have an issue with, you know, kind of picking a percentage and saying we're going to devolve X percentage. I have no problem with, you know, as we've seen the Trailblazers, more consolidated budgets and greater freedoms. Yeah, fewer ring fences. That's a good thing. But at least then you've got a greater sense of what kind of freedoms you're trying to give, rather than a kind of a nebulous, amorphous financial freedom that, for not a particularly clear, I believe, reason for why. So I'm a bit more hawkish on that. There is the problem, because pregnant in that EU funds one, I desperately hope she wouldn't come to me on that one, is that and I don't want to make a particularly hard political point about this, but the Shared Prosperity Fund, there isn't, you know, the promises aren't being kept. So there is an issue there, and that isn't a revenue neutral issue. So I have to be a little bit careful there. And then similarly, you know, again, probably very brave to take this head on given our experience in Nottingham, but you know, where we've seen local authorities fail, there's a question in the questions about whether that was a failure of scrutiny and oversight, and perhaps to a degree that, you know, better scrutiny might have been a canary in the mine sooner in those communities than in mine. But in reality, we do know local government and local authorities, you know, were actively encouraged to, as well by ministers at the time, have taken on a newer range of, say, commercial investments that traditionally wasn't their territory, in order to meet gaps in their funding. And that's had some good benefits in some places, that had some very, very difficult outcomes in elsewhere. So again, we inherit a funding landscape that's very, very challenged. Now, I can't tell you, you know, where we, not least, you know, if we look back a year, the difference we are to where we were even 12 months ago. So to project forward 12 months, you know, we have to wait for the election, I'm afraid, for that on that. But as I say, I would want to recognise that it is a distressed landscape.
Well, I'll just make an intervention for the chair. I won't ask you to respond, but one option about the Gleaming Towers of Woking might be to re-establish a statutory audit commission that can actually provide a proper support for local public accounts committee in a way that has almost disappeared from local government finance at the moment. Now, I'm just going to go quickly round to Jess and then David, and then just as a note of warning, I'm going to ask each person to say three of you to say one thing you'd like to see in a take back control bill, and Alex to give us one thing that's going to be in a take back control bill, if you think you're in a position to do that. But Jess, you've written this week in Municipal Journal about Total Place, which was a Labour initiative that I was involved in back at the time of the Labour government to pool public service budgets. So 1 minute to make a pitch to Alex on Total Place specifically, about why the flexible use of public spending perhaps could be on a future government agenda.
Sure. Well, Total Place is unfinished business for Labour, I think. It began to look at the effectiveness of spend across a place and all the different kind of silos that come into a place, it began to take a place-based look with the citizen at the centre, where there was duplication and waste potentially, where the system didn't make sense from the point of view of the individual. And it began a process of saying there's maybe some wastage or duplication that could be removed by taking a more place-based approach. And it never got time to get going. And of course, a new government came in, but there was a different approach to finding efficiencies, and that focused very much on keeping silos intact, but finding efficiencies within them and potentially outsourcing, potentially cutting budgets. But 13 years on, the limits, that's been maxed out as an approach, and we know that the public sector's on its knees in various different places. So I fundamentally believe that there's no new funding on the horizon. There's no more efficiencies to be squeezed out of the system. The only way forward for public sector reform is to look at the effectiveness of existing spend and how it's allocated across a place, rather than departmental silos, which are functional and historic, and I think have diminishing returns. Maybe more will be written than a 300-word MJ column on that at some stage.
We'll look forward to that. David, there's a Jamie Bilcliffe question, which is essentially aimed at Labour, but it's a reasonable question for anybody who's interested in politics. Is how do you cut the Gordian knot on housing? We need more houses. An element of that is more planning permissions, although it's not all about planning permissions. If you localize, doesn't that mean the NIMBYs always win and you don't get any house building? But if you do it from the centre, doesn't it just become politically impossible? So how would you say that problem could be resolved? Because we've been going around this for years now.
Yeah, you do two things. I represented for nearly 30 years one of the constituencies in England that actually had the fastest rate of housing growth and new building, but huge pressures and controversial. Two things, the two answers to that, John. One, I do think that having a sort of sub-regional level to deal with housing and planning strategies is a way of dealing with this that is more likely to be effective than either just the centre or the local government here doing it. Surplan didn't work brilliantly, but it worked after a fashion for many years. And I suspect that a government of whatever stripe is going to have to reinvent something like Surplan for the South East. Again, the other thing, I can say this, I'm out of Parliament now, is political leadership. And it means being prepared to make the argument to people who are instinctively resistant. And I mean, my personal experience is that you found that when you started saying to a room full of people who were, with grey or white hair, they needed more housing, they bristled. When you said, how many of you have got children or grandchildren who are in full-time jobs but cannot afford to get onto the first rung of the housing ladder and are really struggling, you started to see the grey and white heads nodding. You didn't win them over instantly, but you've got to actually find a way of expressing the argument that cuts through to those people, apart from all the other stuff like improve the design of this, get the infrastructure in at the start, not 10 or 20 years after the housing's been built. Sequencing is important as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to thank the panel in advance because this has been a very rich discussion, but one sentence each, Bren, then Jess, then David, and then Alex. Wish list for a Take Back Control bill. Bren.
I think my number one wish would be that the Take Back Control bill both consolidates what's there already and then clarifies how things are moved forward in the future, whether that's through having a right to whatever somebody else has got, as Alex was talking about earlier, or some other mechanism for drawing down powers and responsibilities that's clear to the actors involved.
Okay. Jess.
A new series of community rights to participate, so that power is kind of enabled from the ground up while it's also pushed out from the top down, but crucially backed up with long-term stable funding for local government, sufficient when economic growth emits more, but in the short term we need stable 3-year, 5-year funding settlements for local government, so that there's capacity can be focused on working out with communities, not up the governance hierarchy.
Thank you. David.
To provide the legal and institutional framework within which the central government of the UK and the devolved governments within sub-regions of England should cooperate, work together in partnership on common challenges. We will not deal with net zero or an industrial strategy or digital transformation by trying to micromanage it from an office in Whitehall. You will need that partnership.
Thank you. Alex.
I'll get the final word. I mean, I'm going to say, because there's easier ones I could do, I'm going to avoid the layup and say community power. You know, I know that hasn't, and Jess wasn't able to quite stimulate too much conversation on it. Devolution to new and novel structures is exciting and interesting and eye-catching, and making the settlement, you know, more consolidated, as others have said, is really, really important. The community power should be on the same footing as that if we really want the benefits of devolution beyond just economic ones.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And that was a great answer, great suggestions. I think it's been a very rich discussion, shedding lots of light on different angles of this question, and clearly a shared commitment to see things happen in the future and learn the lessons from the past. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you on the call. Sorry for the questions that I wasn't, or I failed to take. That's my fault, not yours. And we'll keep you in touch and send everybody links to the video when it's being posted. Thank you very much indeed.